This episode is proudly supported by Montague, handpicked for you.
So the eating experience of our plums is sweet. That's a primary driver. It's got to be sweet, but it's also got to have enough acid, because the mix of acid and sugar is what gives fruit its flavour. And in a plum, it tends to be slightly higher acidity. And then a really nice, full, not dry, but juicy explosion of juice into your mouth as you bite into it. That's nirvana for us in terms of plum.
For more information, go to montague.com.au.
I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Wiradjuri people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Go out there and just the energy at that vineyard for me is something else. Like you go out there and it's, I don't know, the air's different, the feel of the place is different to everywhere else I've been. It's you kind of just have to experience it. I can't really explain it.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Gertie Wines is the epitome of a micro wine operation with a very big heart. And Ben Marx is the cheeky fellow behind the label. With over 20 years in the industry, Marxy is known for his knowledge of growing grapes and making wine. Hi Marxy, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for putting some time aside for me. Now, you were dragged onto this podcast by sheer peer pressure. You're not usually the type to shout from the rooftops about yourself, or if I got that wrong, maybe you are.
I think I'd like to tell the world about, what I'm doing and about my brand, but it generally tends to be, there's not enough hours in a day, so I tend to be sort of a little bit reclusey. But, I guess that's part of country life as well, so I'm okay with that.
I think that you're just very humble, but it's true. You do have a lot on your plate. Would you, for everybody listening, can you run us through a little bit about how or where your journey in wine began?
Oh, geez, it started way, way back. I was actually inspired a little bit by Keanu Reeves, of all people. I think it was like one of the first times I was allowed home without a babysitter. So I sort of, the first thing you do is you stay up late and watch TV. I think it was like a Wednesday night or something, so there wasn't exactly heaps of options. And this is back in the day. There was only 3 TV channels back then. And one of the movies was it was called A Walk in the Clouds and Keanu Reeves was the main actor in it. And I sort of stayed up and watched that, and it was pretty soppy. It's a love story. I've gone back and watched it since, and it's pretty cringe. But anyway, I got inspired. I thought, hey, that's what I want. That's the dream. And so I just kind of went from there and wanted to be a winemaker or viticulturalist ever since. So from there, I went back and started studying chemistry so I could get into university. Did a few overseas vintages, mucked around for a bit. And I think it's a bit like when you get the travel bug, you get bitten by it and you can't let it go. And I think the wine industry is quite like that, because the more you learn, the more you're drawn in. And the more you're drawn in, the more you learn, and it just becomes this perpetual cycle that I honestly don't think I could get out of, even if I wanted to.
Yeah, it's certainly intoxicating in more ways than one.
Oh, absolutely. And I think from then I just sort of, got in, more you learn. I've done a little stint in the UK selling wine for Majestic. I met some wonderful people along the way. It always staggers me in this industry how generous people are, just with information, learnings, what they've done, what worked, what didn't work. All you've got to do is ask the question. It's such an amazing industry in that respect.
Whereabouts did you travel when you went overseas?
I've done quite a few vintages through Australia. So I'm originally from New Zealand, so I did quite a few through New Zealand. I had a tiny little brand called Marxman when I was at uni, which I sort of, made 2 barrels of wine and sold it to friends and family and whatnot. And then sort of went through Central Otago, then Western Australia, Victoria, England, Italy, France.
I like that idea of Markman. I mean, I feel like that could come back maybe as a grappa or something like that, but I love the name of it. I think that needs to be revisited at some point.
Yeah, I've still got it. I think I've got about 3 bottles left just for memorable, The wine's terrible, but, it was a living.
What was your first memory of kind of drinking wine and really enjoying it? Do you have like a moment where, you had a particular bottle that kind of stands out for you?
I think it would probably be back in the UK. Like, you have like wines that you really love, there's wines that stick with you, but the ones that really stuck with me, when you work, because everything's incentivized over there, they come and do like a big tasting just before Christmas, all the big name brands, and there was Figeac was one of the wines we tasted. It was an 01 Figeac, and there was Krug. I can't remember what vintage it was, but I remember tasting those wines and just thinking, holy smokes, like that's why people love Bordeaux, and that's why people love Champagne. It was just, it had everything. It touches you, like you put it in your mouth and it touches every single sense that there is. It was amazing wines. So I've still got a bottle of 01 Figeac in the cellar. I'm too scared to taste it, just in case it was, not as good as I remember, but always hold on to that. It was really, really good.
Well, and it probably, it can spend a lot more time in your cellar. Those wines tend to only just get better and better. So, but don't let it go too long and miss the opportunity.
No, I think if that happens, I'll just keep it for sentimental value forever.
Now, Telma, you've worked in the Clare for a little while now, and you've certainly worked for some of the biggest names of the Clare Valley. What were your biggest takeaways at your time at Napstein and now at Jim Barry?
I think the moment that sticks with me the most at Nappers was we were in a tasting, like we used to do allocation tastings and benchmark tastings all the time. And I remember we were sort of down in the tasting room underneath the winery, and just I'd been working really, really hard, and I got to the point where I was thinking, geez, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. Like, I've been working really, really hard on my palate, trying to get, dial it in and understand it, and then there's a eureka moment that comes. It had just been working so hard on it, so hard, and then all of a sudden we sat down for one allocation tasting, and I remember it was Glenn Barry was the chief winemaker there, and I remember sitting down at that tasting, and he was put his glass down and he was gobsmacked. It's like, holy, look at you, come from being way off to just nailing it, and it was just all that hard work just paid off, and it all just fell into place one day. So that's probably my most exciting memory out of Nappers. And then moving across to Jim Barry, I think, by which point we'd had some amazing times through Nappers. It was an amazing corporate. It was owned by Lion at the time, and we had amazing times. The takeaways from there were endless, but we knew we had it good when we were there as well. So that was always an amazing point to take away as well. It's all very well to say that was an amazing time, but I wish I'd known it at the time. We knew it at the time, and it was awesome. And then moving across to Barry's, I think at that point, their resources are, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, but our resource of fruit is amazing. We've literally got some of the best vineyards in Clare, and we get to pick and choose the bits out of them. So we get to make, wines that a lot of people in Clare, they can't make because they don't have the fruit resource. So, I think that's always a really, really exciting part of the job for working through Barry's.
The Clare is an incredible part of Australia, and some of the wines coming out of the Clare are so distinctive. But what do you love, and what do you think makes the Clare Valley unique if we kind of talk about it in an Australian sense and both in an international sense as well?
Well, we do. I think the Barrys have kind of done it quite well, shown a really good expression of it, because we do what's a collaboration with Ernie Lewson. So we make a clear Riesling in the Germanic style, and they make a Germanic Riesling in the Clare style. And I think even with those two, like with the intention of trying to make it a different style, it's not as genuine. It just doesn't feel right. I love the wine, but I think, especially from the German coming this way, I've always wondered sometimes terroir and the whole ecosystem of where the fruit comes from, you just can't replicate it, and it just really suits our style. And I think for me, Clare has this. It's not a valley that's just straight up and down. There's lots of these little offshoots and like all those sort of air currents. They all flow differently. There's different altitudes. There's different aspects. There's it's such a little tapestry of vineyards and little ecosystems within those, which I think that's what makes Clare special. And the fact that at night it's cold. Like we're still getting down to 13 degrees at night at the moment, yet we're having 40-degree days. So I think in that respect, I think Clare it's this little pocket, and it is, I think when you start exploring the back roads of Clare, it is actually a beautiful valley. I think a lot of people take it for granted, but you sort of start hunting around and there's some actually breathtaking scenery. And we were lucky enough to buy a vineyard, was that in 2020? Probably one of the worst years ever to buy a vineyard due to the drought. But you live and learn. And that's in one of those spots. We're at about 560 metres to 580 metres above sea level, so that's pretty high even by Clare standards. But it's a little amphitheatre. It's an amazing spot, and you go out there and just the energy at that vineyard for me is something else. Like you go out there and it's, I don't know, the air's different, the feel of the place is different to everywhere else I've been. It's you kind of just have to experience it. I can't really explain it.
Well, I like that. You have to be there to see it and experience it. And there's a lot of things like that in life. It's just that age-old saying is you should have been here yesterday, or you've just got to feel it and see it. So I agree with you on that point. I think the Clare for me as well, the wines are transient in time, and for me personally, I think that the Rieslings, the Shiraz, the Malbec, they really are wines that look fantastic on release, but just look sensational with time. And it's probably my recommendation that people give some of the Rieslings, longer than you experience you think in the cellar, because I think that they really have the longevity to last. And I think that, in particular, Shiraz looks amazing with some time in bottle.
I 100% agree. And I think, for the Gertie brand, I've always kept at least an entire layer of a pallet back for library stock. I mean, my production's tiny. A massive year for me would be 3.5 tons. Like, I make wine from very specific vineyards, chasing a very specific style, because it's wine I'm making that I want to drink without any restrictions from anyone else. But that's quite a big percentage of that make. But I think just with time, the wines evolve, they create themselves. There's a lot of things there that I think we don't understand as people, how things evolve, why they evolve, what are the chemical reactions in there, how are tannins reacting, how's, the mouthfeel, the alcohol, how are all these things interacting. And I think that's, like you say, the wines are built, and I just think we're only just starting to realise how built they are and how long they can go.
Now, Gertie Wines began in 2016. I love everything about Gertie Wines. I love the label is one of the prettiest labels you have ever seen. I love that you started as a single varietal bottling, and Cabernet Franc of all things. It really says so much about you, this understated, like I said, cheeky fellow that probably says more in what you don't say. But how did Gertie Wines all come about?
So at the time, I was sort of inspired by a couple of mates that were sort of going out and doing their own thing. And I sort of got stopped and thought about it, and I thought, like, all the wine I've made, like, I've got to work with some absolute amazing, like, legends of the wine industry. but it's always making wine for someone else. So the onus has always kind of been like, you know, it's you as a winemaker, you kind of have to step aside and say, well, this isn't my choice because I don't own this wine particularly. But in this instance, you can, and you can say, those decisions are mine, and I want to see how good a winemaker, or bad, I really am. Like, I want to go out there and see it. And I think that's where it kind of started, that sort of thought process. And then I thought, hey, Cabernet Franc, I mean, I've always thought that would do amazing in Clare. And there used to be quite a lot of plantings of it. But I guess my advice now would be, if you're going to start a brand where there's fruit available. Everyone's pulled it out, or it's, you know, long gone. But I think I wanted something it was never meant to be a wine show wine. It was never meant to take over the world. It was just meant to be, you know, a nice little project for me, some experiment, some, you know, I guess a test for me to see if I can do it. And the name came around. It was actually my great aunt who was, I don't know, she was a little bit of a feminist, I guess, in a way back in the day. She was always, you know, when women were sort of, you know, had that real cliche of, you know, stay at home and, you know, look after, raise the kids and all that. She was out there, you know, punching out. She was, you know, out on the farm helping. She was getting in and getting amongst it, and kind of went against that stereotype. And I thought that was quite fitting for this brand. The wine's not out there to be winning shows. It's not out there to be, you know, if you like it, you like it. If you don't, that's okay. You don't have to. And I think that's kind of, I always thought that was quite fitting, because I think Gertie, great aunt Gertie, she didn't really care about what other people thought. She was just out there doing it.
She sounds like a force to be reckoned with, and I like her already. What are the pros and cons of kind of Cabernet Franc in the vineyard? I mean, my experience of Cabernet Franc, you know, has been a little bit, you know, of kind of maybe Wendouree, but, you know, a lot of kind of Chinon and a lot of France. And I remember when I listed your Gertie wine for the first vintage on the list at Key, and it was in this tiny little, you know, little lonesome area of its own of Clare Valley Cabernet Franc. And I thought, wow, I hope that one day I see that and it's got a few more listings down there next to it, but they're going to have to be pretty good wines to be listed. And it is such a beautiful wine. But talk me through how it behaves in the vineyard.
Oh, in the vineyard, it's one of those, I mean, as a grape, it's kind of, I guess, it's very similar to Cabernet. It can get a little bit, I don't know, sensitive around flowering. It does get a little bit of, you know, berry shatter, so they don't quite, the berries don't necessarily set particularly well. It's pretty resilient. Like, it, as far as drought goes, it's not scared of, you know, some dry, hot days. But I think I'll talk you through our vineyard, because that's probably what I've got the most. I do take from a couple of growers as well, so I guess I'll talk about how I treat Cabernet Franc, because that's what I know. But we go against any chemical, so we've gone against, well, we no longer use copper or sulfur on the vineyard. So we've made life pretty hard. Like, conventional viticulture is conventional because it works and it's, you know, efficient. We have to do masses of hands-on shoot thinning and bunch thinning and things like that to make sure that we concentrate heavily on airflow through the vineyard and through the vines. So that's almost our, that's how we combat fungal disease, keeping it dry, keeping airflow running through the vines. And we also work on plant resilience. So plant health is critical for us. So when we go out spraying, we're tweaking all those little sort of micronutrients. So we're using sort of a kelp-based extract. We use a product called Nutrisoil, which is like a worm castings. We use a product called Stimplex, which is, again, kind of an organic-y, just refined micronutrients and things like that to help stimulate resilience within the vine. And I think that for us, It's tough. Cabernet Franc is a tough varietal. It doesn't mind. Like, it's pretty resilient to most pests. It's reasonably resilient to, because the bunches are quite sort of open and the berries are reasonably small. It gets a lot of airflow through, so it's not overly susceptible to fungal disease. So I guess in some respects it's actually really suited to the clear. But like I say, no one has it anymore. It's not cool.
I think it's pretty cool. What when you say, you're producing a Cabernet Franc that you want to drink, what are you trying to avoid? If you were to say, that these are the mistakes I think some people make when it comes to Cabernet Franc. So what are you trying to produce in terms of something that you want to drink?
I always think about it and think, there's a lot of wine that I can sit down and drink a glass, really, really enjoy it. But would I go back for a second glass? Maybe, but not necessarily. I wanted to make a wine that you drink by the bottle. Like, you can sit down, and that runs a really fine line for me. Like, it needs to be drinkable, it needs to have a easiness about it. But it also has to have an interest element, because if it's just boring and too easy to drink, you just kind of get bored of it before the end of the bottle, and that's it. You're back to square one. So for me, I think it's about brightness of fruit. It's about interest, and building interest into wine is actually really, really hard. It's easy to make sort of sterile, fruit-driven wines, but I think adding interest, but not faults, if you know what I mean. You can't rely on VA to give you interest, because it doesn't quite work like that. It needs to be interest of lees contact. It needs to be interest of, old or oak. It needs to be interest of, skin contact. It needs to be interest from, tannin structure from skins. And it's not about just leaving it on skins. It's a very, there's a time. You'll see tannins build and build and build and build and build. And then once they hit their pinnacle, bam, that's when you got to go. That's when you press. It's not I'll leave it on there for 3 weeks because that sounds like a good number. It's meticulously tasting all the time. And then you get those components, and then you put them together, and you almost like build the wine. So you're building the structure, you're building the flavor profile, you're building the aromatics, you're building all the bits sort of come together and make a wine that, hopefully people are drinking by the bottle.
I think it's so interesting that you talk about drinkability with Cabernet Franc, because my experience for a long time of Cabernet Franc was such hard, muscular, almost mean wines. And I think the best Cabernet Francs have a real pretty lithe element to them. And I think you've captured that in Gertie Wines. They have, like you said, the kind of exotic aromatics, but beautiful acidity, and then, firm tannins, but very grainy and dusty. And you've kind of ticked all the boxes. And like you said, it is a wine that's just, it's so alive and indulgent in a way as well. And I'm really interested to see, I know with the first vintage that, after another a year in the bottle, it was a completely different beast. So I've kept one of each of your first few vintages in the cellar just to see, and I'm really looking forward to trying them later down the track.
And I mean, when I started this project, these wines were never made to, live for 100 years. That was never their intention. I sort of kept them back, and I sort of taste, each year I taste back through all the vintages. And that 2016 is like, in my mind, when I made that wine, I thought, 5 years it'll be fallen over. But it doesn't really matter, because who's going to cellar it for 5 years? They'll probably, hopefully people are drinking it. But that wine's smoking. I look back on that wine and think, geez, like that's still in a really, really good place. So, and I guess that comes back to that sort of element of understanding of what's going on in that bottle that we don't really grasp yet, about, interaction between tannins and, reduction in sulfur and, all of my wines, none of them are fined and none of them are filtered. They're just racked. So I guess leaving all that sediment behind, but they're still going to bottle with a fair whack of turbidity. They're certainly not going through any sterile filtration or anything like that. So I guess, there's an element there again that we don't understand. How are those things that are left in there acting within that equilibrium of, of aging and bottle? So I mean, there's so much there, but yeah, you can get carried away with it and talk about it for hours.
And that's where you, like you said, the more you get into wine, the more it draws you in and the more there is to find out. And like you said, you can have all the technical aspects of the wine, but there's some things that you don't know until, you taste them later down the track.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the mystery, part of the wonder about wine. There's so much that we don't know. And I mean, the same goes into viticulture. There's so much within that plant and soil health and things like that we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg. And the more you get into it, the more you kind of like, wow, that makes so much sense. So my winter read this year was Nicole Masters' book called For the Love of Soil, and she talks about soil health and we can talk about it, but soil health in general. But she gets down into more intricate sort of parts of it, and there's books that go into much more depth than hers, but hers was just that really good level for where I am in my journey about interpreting things to a meaning. Everyone has weeds in their vineyard. What are those weeds telling you? And I sort of read the book and went out into the vineyard and sort of, there's a patch of sort of, docks grows there. So why do they grow there? There's probably compaction and, a boggy part. Sure enough, boggy part, there's a little spring that comes out there. It's always, reasonably heavily compacted there because you go drive over wet soil with the tractor, and it starts sort of making sense. You start stopping and thinking, well, geez, if that makes sense, what about these other weeds? What do they mean? And, what's that telling me? It's all these amazing things that we're just learning and learning and learning. So much that we don't know. It's such an exciting journey, I guess.
Yeah, always changing. I love that. Talk to me a little bit about your approach in the vineyards, because I know that you make a solid effort to think kind of eco-friendly. So talk to me a little bit about that approach in your vineyard.
So we were incredibly lucky. We bought this vineyard off an older gentleman who was sort of winding down, I guess, wanting to, it was becoming too much for him. So he planted the block in 1984. He replanted after Ash Wednesday. So it was originally planted for Grosset. So it used to go into his Polish Hill before Grosset got into, planted his own vineyards. And he always, because it was, planted for Grosset, it was always sort of managed, I guess, in a respectful way to the environment. We wanted to carry that on, but we kind of wanted also to take it a little bit further in the respect that it's not, I guess there was that whole natural wine movement, and now there's sort of that whole, sustainable viticulture movement. And I think we're not doing it to be cool or fit into that area. Like we're not certified anything. We just do it because we think that's what's right to do. And I think going into the vineyard, how can we make our vineyard, like this is our block, we're in a very fortunate position that, I work a day job and, worst case scenario, we lost a year's crop in the vineyard. Yeah, sure, that would set us back a fair way, but it's not going to sink us. Like we're not going under because we lose a crop. So in that situation, why don't we push a boundary? Why don't we see how far we can go? And I think the more you read and the more you talk to, the older generation throughout the valley, and there's heaps of them, and they are just itching to give info. They just need to be asked. And I think for me that pushing into that sort of, regenerative agricultural type zone, I mean, yeah, sure, it may seem like we're moving with a trend, but I guess that's part of the reason why we don't, sing it from the hilltops on social media. I'm probably one of the worst people at social media. Terrible. But I think, I don't think you need to scream it from the hilltops if it's something that you really believe in and are doing it. Because I don't have time to go out there and do photo shoots in the vineyard because I'm out there shoot thinning or, tucking or, things like that. I guess it almost relates back to time and what's important. And for us, that whole, less chemicals, healthy plants creating resilience on their own, that for me is driven from the soil up. If you have soil that's in impeccable condition, everything you grow in there is going to have, from your veggies that you grow out in the veggie garden, are going to be full of nutrients. They'll be nutrient dense. Your vines will be healthy. Your fruit's got to have better flavour because you've got a vine in its prime. And I think those sort of nuances for us are what's making the difference.
I totally agree with you, and I think that it's such a smart approach, but it also makes a lot of sense. A lot of people talk about cover crops and the benefits of, like you said, using kind of native species. What are the benefits, just to run us through, to the vine, to the soil? What are the choices that you're making? Because I think that is something that I don't think anyone's ever explained on the podcast, and I just think it's quite fascinating, especially in the different approaches around Australia.
Well, there's a couple of people that have been doing this longer than I have. I think Dan Falkenberg's probably the oracle of it. But for us, we were quite lucky when we bought the vineyard. We had a pretty good stand of native grasses throughout the vineyard anyway. So we're starting from a reasonably good base. But I think it's not just about, for me, natives. I've sort of, on our journey, I sort of went along this path where I was obsessed with having everything, like I want to be 100% native, the whole vineyard. And then it's sort of, my partner Catherine sort of said, we were talking one night, and she said, but what's in the soil? Like, our primary production here is grapes. They're not native. And you start thinking, well, you're right, they're not. So we're taking, natives, it's native soil, it's native plants, that creates its own ecosystem. But we've introduced this other catalyst of grapes. They're taking out, so every grape or every leaf that we lose off that property, we have to replace that somehow. So where I was going down a line of being, we need to have natives because that's what that creates the best ecosystem and the best, beneficial bugs and things like that. We sort of went down this path of, well, we need to replace what we're taking off. So maybe that's not going to be done by purely natives. So now we're looking at, trying to broaden that out. What's the vine taking out each year of the soil? So what do we need to replace, and how much of it do we need to replace? So those sorts of things, we're sort of going fairly heavily down there. And, you have to be a little bit reactive as well because, we've had such a wet start to this season. So compaction's going to be an issue moving forward, just because we had to get out there and get nutritional sprays on for the vineyard. We didn't have a choice. We had to get out there. I did a couple of blocks by backpack, but, it's just so much time. So I think as far as cover crops go for me, this year we're focused on building carbon. Because we had such a wet winter, we've gone along the lines of, so we let masses, like we've mowed twice this year. On a wet year, that's not many passes. But our aim there is to try and grow as much leaf mass as we possibly can, have as much photosynthesis happening on our block as we possibly can, building soil fungi and bacteria down in the soil. And then once we knock all that off, so we won't mow any closer to the ground than about a foot. So my slash is literally on its highest setting, because what we're looking for is to build like a mat across the soil. So we have no bare soil on our vineyard at all. That's like if you see bare soil, the kids are on me. That's bare soil, Dad. And I'm like, oh, geez, better get on that. So that's just opening up places for weeds to grow. But those sorts of things for me, like looking at the season, and yes, we've got surplus water this year. We've got the cover crop there. Let's build it. Let's pull it up. Like, let's get it really cranking. And this is our opportunity to get free carbon, because it's all going back into the soil. It's going to take some time, sure, but we're running at about 2% carbon in our soil at the moment. I want to get it to 10. Well, our first port of call is to get it to 5%, which is, I think, where the sort of it becomes, you start getting close to a perpetual cycle with, the amount of carbon that's in the soil growing enough on top of the soil and within the soil to sort of almost start being self-sustainable. So those sorts of goals, but you've got to look at that on the year that's ahead of you as well. Because if you're having if this turned out to be a drought year, we would have put ourselves in a mountain of poo, because it would have sucked all of the water out. Vines would be stunted. Would have short shoots, struggling berries, especially now when it suddenly got hot. Right at that cell division stage, where you're setting the size of your berries almost. And you run out of water. Back to square one. So it's such a complex beast, and there's so many theories that you sort of come up with, and but again, it's coming back to talking to people, throwing these discussions around, having them.
I don't envy you when it comes to all of those decisions that you do have to make in challenging years, that's for sure. What is the plan for Gertie Wines? I know there's talk about Malbec, is that right, joining the line?
In the past, I do a collaboration with a guy, Seb, who owns Real Wines. So I do a little collaboration sort of side label with him. So I think the intention is to grow for sure. So we've got Grenache Gris in the ground. So I was hoping this year we might have a crack at a rosé, but just looking at the fruit, it was a pretty tough flowering. Not sure whether we're going to get enough to make it viable, but we'll see. We'll try. What is exciting is in 2021, I took a parcel of fruit that I was pretty excited about. I thought, wow. And I was just sort of, at that point, I was just looking at things and thinking, where is this brand going? And I thought, geez, we need premiumization. We need something like a flagship wine. And in reality, a $35 bottle of like retail world of Cabernet Franc, but the costs are only going up. That's not going to be sustainable forever. So I thought, wow, why don't we make well, I haven't named it yet because we're still working through the packaging, but I'm doing a premium Cabernet Franc. So it's built around, I guess it's a little bit of a nerdy winemakers, those who will get it. Those who don't just completely will not get it. But there's only about 150 litres of it. It's off a very specific block, and I wanted to build a wine with structure and tannin, but I didn't want to build that from oak for two reasons. One, it's not big enough volume to fill an oak barrel, and B, you can't. To add oak to wine, you almost need to have enough of it to spread, like almost a shotgun approach, I guess, because too much of one barrel becomes, the dominating feature. You need, some aspects of this barrel, some aspects of those barrels, and then you kind of build your masterpiece from there. So what I did is I thought, well, how can I get this? So I hived some off into a VC, which is a variable capacity tank, and I've gone along this line thinking, well, how do I build this? How do I make a wine that's so interesting and has enough draw and enough quality aspects to be, to start dabbling in that, $100 a bottle type territory? And so I've built that through skin tannin. I've built that through that interaction with acid, and I've, built in, considered the fact of where's the weight coming from, and it's coming from, it comes from the alcohol, it comes from the interaction between tannin and acid, it comes from, time on lees to build in that sort of creamier mid palate. There's all these things that I've basically put everything I've learnt to date into this wine, thinking in a calculated way, thinking, how do I get these aspects that I need without the resource of, just using oak as that builder. And I'm pretty excited about this wine. Its packaging's going to be sick. It's ridiculous. It's so expensive. It'll be worth it. It'll be fine.
How exciting. And that sounds like a giant of a wine in terms of just the thought process behind it, but sounds really, really special. And I think that there's definitely a little gap in the market there for something so special that, like a lot of things, the problem will be that there's not much to go around, but very exciting.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. But we're just still working through a few packaging details and hopefully be on the market before the end of the year.
Well, a lot to live up to, because your other label of Gertie Wines is just one of my favourites, and something a lot of people comment on, actually. So, yeah, you've got a lot to live up to. Now, Marxy, if you know this question's coming, if you could only drink 3 boozy beverages for the rest of your life, what are they going to be?
Geez, I've been thinking about this because I've listened to a few of your podcasts and I knew this was coming. And I thought, and to be honest, I still haven't really come to a conclusion. But I think for me, it's seasonal. It's pretty warm here. So we'll be tickling probably close to 40 degrees here today. And I think for me, it's got to start with something like a G&T. I mean, I know it's a little bit cliche, but how refreshing and cleansing is that after a hot day?
100%.
Jeez, I'd have to put wine. Like, do I have to narrow it down to a varietal of wine?
No, you can do whatever you want.
I mean, wine would have to be in there, but I think primarily something in that lighter red spectrum, lighter Syrah type territory. And geez, number 3. If I'm going deep, like if I'm settling in, a dirty martini. So good.
It's so good. They're so delicious. And yeah, one of those, the problem with the dirty martini, I find, is that they're so good that I'm always like, should we go another? And, my heart is saying yes. And so's the rest of my body. But my brain's going, no, I don't think that's a great idea, And it's often a battle.
I always have them at the end of the night as well, and I think, man, you should have stopped before then. But
yeah, that martini, that's what did it. That put you right over the edge. That's what accounts for all those bad decisions. The Marx man at it again.
When your alarm goes off at sort of 5 a.m, so you go out shoot thinning or pruning or something like that, man, you're feeling it.
Yeah, don't doubt it. Well, Marxy, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. And look at you go, 45 minutes. I knew you had it in you. Thank you so much for making time.
No worries. Thanks a lot.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.